Hello, Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce members. This is Drew Kamp, President and CEO, back for our 2023 round of our weekly legislative updates throughout legislative session, which is scheduled to go into April this year. So we had the first week and the kickoff of the session on Monday, the governor's condition of the state on Tuesday, condition of the judiciary Wednesday, condition of the guard on Thursday, and then obviously all the leadership gave their speeches and their proposals and laid out what they're looking at doing within their respective chambers and caucuses. A few of the big things that I want to touch on as far as the governor's priorities and things that she laid out, not only in her condition of the state, but her budget proposal that came out based on the December revenue estimating conference numbers. Obviously, as we all know, school choice is her priority 1, 2, 3, 4 before it even gets to the second issue. But one of the things that she proposes, it's a big proposal. It would be about $107 million this year. I believe it's something along the lines of like it would allow up to like $1,200 and then keep $7,500 or something like that for each student in the local district, depending on if they were to leave and take some funding with them for private school. But the thing about the fact that it starts at 107 is it balloons up to well over 200, 300 million in the years down the line. And then there's less restrictions on it after that fact. So that's something, as we look at what the opponents to the legislation are saying, that's something you'll see a lot of them voicing because that's a huge concern of theirs. And also there's not a lot of accountability provisions in there. And obviously, as most people look at that, if you're going to get public tax dollars, what accountability provisions are there going to be? So that's going to be a lot of the talking and a lot of the issues that are going to have to be resolved regarding that big bill. She also talked a lot about healthcare and healthcare apprenticeships and also just the training, because we know of the nursing shortage and a lot of the issues we're seeing, especially during and now post-COVID. Those are things that we're seeing a lot of. Tort reform is something we're very excited to hear as a border community, especially the med-mal side of things, but also transportation tort reform. Government consolidation is a huge issue. So she wants to consolidate, the governor wants to consolidate 37 state agencies to 16. It's a 2,500 page piece of legislation. So you can imagine how long it's going to take just for even the staff to get through that so they can even have a knowledgeable conversation about it. So that's going to be something we're going to be watching closely. A few things to really note that are applicable to our organization. Our Iowa Economic Development Authority would absorb much of cultural affairs, especially the placemaking and some of those improvement programs. They wouldn't necessarily take all of it. They would just take the pieces that are applicable to community economic development and growing our economy in the state. But then also IWD, we've been talking about this, Iowa Workforce Development is taking on a lot of the job training, the apprenticeship, the internships, that's part of that bill as well. One thing that's especially of note here in our community, for example, though, is the Iowa School for the Deaf would go from the Board of Regents to the Department of Education. So watching what that looks like, because obviously that's a huge piece of property. There's a lot of staff there. They're a big part of our economy. So we obviously need to make sure that we're watching what that means for that organization, as well as we support John and his team over there as they take a look and digest what that may mean for them. One thing that was interesting in the governor's speech is she did not refer to property taxes. That was a very interesting approach because the House has already dropped a property tax bill. We know for a fact, obviously, in talking to Senator Dawson, he's going to drop a very large property tax bill paired with Iowa and the funding of the Natural Resource and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund. So it was just kind of interesting to not see her speak up to that issue that's going to be a major one this session. And maybe it is so she can kind of see what's presented on both sides in both chambers. I don't know, but only time will tell as to how that approach was determined. One of the things that also is important is there's a lot of new members in the House. There's some in the Senate, but even more in the House. In the majority, I believe there's about 24 new members out of the 64. So that's something, there's a bringing up to speed kind of thing. So one of the big issues, if you recall, education reform, vouchers, whatever you want to call it, they were not able to get it done because the House could not get the 51 votes. So it's going to be interesting. They think a lot of people are saying that they can get it done early in the session to avoid it sucking a lot of oxygen out of the chamber or out of the Capitol, excuse me. But that's something we'll just have to wait and see on because it is a very big issue. And oftentimes the Senate and the House don't see eye to eye on these things. So while we'll just have to wait and see what comes of those discussions. Also, another really big thing that the governor put out in her speech is that a review of administrative rules by March. All agency heads are supposed to do a review by March. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of administrative rules and regulations and things. So that gives them a very short window to do a review. But then one other thing she added is that all of them will sunset in 2026. And one of the things just to note is, just so you know, already agencies are required to do a review every 5 years. In addition to what she put out, there's also a moratorium on all new rulemaking that's not already in progress. And one thing that we're concerned about with this is it just remains to be seen, is because there's a lot of unknowns about it still, is obviously she's trying to streamline processes, cut red tape. Everyone understands that, but we just need to make sure that whatever and however this is done, it doesn't create uncertainty for the private sector. For example, just one major industry in the state of Iowa, finance, insurance. That's something, obviously people are going to be watching a lot of these things very closely, because anytime you create uncertainty in the market, that's a negative. So we just want to make sure that that does not happen in this case. With regards to the Iowa Economic Development Authority, obviously an organization we watch very closely as a state agency, and Debbie and her team, consolidation is most definitely applicable to them. Debbie will be taking on much of cultural affairs, which would mean Chris Kramer would come underneath her as like a VP kind of role to oversee those existing cultural affairs programs that would come under IEDA. One other new thing that she proposed is a mega site program. So just think of this as something, we have a 1,300 or so acre mega site certified site in Mills County that Mid-American and the Mills County Economic Development Organization really worked really hard on to get certified here in the last couple of years. But that's something you're seeing projects $1 billion plus that have the possibility and going in there with some of these, cutting edge new technologies, whether it's hydrogen fuel cell, whatever it may be. There's a lot of opportunities there. So we need to have a program to compete with states like the Carolinas, who are kicking butt in that regard. Plus also Tennessee, Kansas has a program for it. So we just need to make sure that we're not kind of behind the 8 ball and behind the times on that. So that's something Debbie's working on. We do plan on advocating strongly for that, largely due to the fact working with our partners in Mills County and at Mid-American Energy for that mega site project, because that could be hugely instrumental and impactful for them. And then perhaps the best news that came out of a call we had with Debbie when she was explaining some of the changes coming to her and her programs in her organization is that Debbie is going to be here for another 4 years. That's huge for our organization, and it's huge for our profession because not only now will she oversee IFA and IEDA, but if approved by the legislature, she'll oversee cultural affairs. That's hugely important because of the relationship we have with her and the ability we have to work with her to really get things done and make sure that Southwest Iowa is getting the attention it deserves. So that was something I was very, very excited about, to hear that she will be here another 4 years. A few last items that I want to touch on. One thing that was kind of interesting this year, and Matt Winchell will be definitely someone to speak to regarding this, because obviously he's the majority leader in the House, but they took an interesting approach this year, and they filed their 13 priority bills right off the bat. And they had 40 plus sponsors on them, and they had the speaker and the majority leader on them. So obviously that speaks to a consensus and really moving those issues forward within their chamber. It remains to be seen how they would be received in the Senate. But that's something that we haven't seen before. So there obviously was some strategy there between the House Republican caucus. So definitely, if you have questions about that, make sure you're reaching out to Brent or Matt Winchell to talk a little bit about some of their priorities, which included the Education Savings Account, ESG, which is like those government funds and how they're invested. It's public assistance, integrity, school curriculum, transparency, workforce development, gender identity pieces, mandatory reporters. Those were some of the issues that were involved in those 13 priority bills. But we'll have a good opportunity to talk to Brent and Matt and Dan and others at our first legislative roundtable 2 weeks from today. The last thing I wanted to touch on, as far as what we heard from the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate President, is really the education reform and property tax were things that were their focus in the Senate Majority as they look at what they want to accomplish this year. So obviously that's very telling as far as where their focal points are going to be. And obviously Senator Dawson's going to be right in the thick of that property tax discussion, as well as moving Iowa forward. The last thing I want to say before we quit for this week's recording is one thing we'll be watching closely too is what we're hearing. Obviously, there's some big issues, and how they're able to move those. It will be dependent upon how the session goes. But one thing we are hearing is that they're originally, from the beginning, is a yearning to get out early and adjourn session early. And one of the big reasons for that is the Iowa Supreme Court is set to debate and make a ruling on the fetal heartbeat bill. And some are saying that if that's done while they're still in session, that will prolong session, because there's a good group of folks in the respective caucuses in both chambers that would want to see something done on that front, depending on what the courts did. So that's something we are hearing, that they might want to try to adjourn before that's done, so then they can have more time to digest it and maybe try to do something next session, versus to try to do kind of a more knee-jerk immediate reaction to whatever the Supreme Court may have as far as a ruling. So with that kind of wraps up this week's legislative update. As a reminder, these will be going on every Friday throughout session. We think it's really important to make sure that our members are informed and educated of what's happening at the State House, because it's so impactful, both here locally on a state and regional level, as far as how we can compete, especially with our friends across the river. So with that, I will conclude this week's weekly legislative update and just say Happy New Year. And thank you so much for continuing to support the Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce. We really are honored and so proud to be able to serve you in the capacities in which we do. Have a great weekend.